Well, a great cathedral, such as Ely undoubtedly is, can be approached from many different angles. And the angle I'm going to take is one that goes against most of our modern presuppositions. We're not used to, nowadays, thinking of architecture as having meaning. It has function, it has technological interest, but symbolic meaning is not something that we are used to, or at least symbolic meaning that has been intended by the designers, the patrons, and the builders. But all of the great medieval cathedrals have such meaning, and that meaning goes back to the training of the patrons, the people who commissioned these buildings, and to the design techniques of the time. The patrons, of course, were clergy, and despite what a lot of people seem to think nowadays, medieval clergy were steeped in the Bible. They knew their Bibles extremely well, and the liturgy, that is the services of the church, were thoroughly also based on the Bible. And we know, for instance, that the vast majority of clergy would have known the Psalms off by heart. So they would be thinking in those terms. And so what I'm going to be talking about is what we can understand as we look at this building and its details of what they mean or what they meant to the people who designed them, and what they can still mean to those of us nowadays who actually know what we're looking at and what was intended. The first view that one has of the cathedral, well, the first view one has of a cathedral is normally from some distance, and as Valerie mentioned, Ely is on a prominence in the fens. The fens have dropped considerably since their draining, so I think Ely is now something like 15 feet, which is a large eminence in that area. So one can see it from a distance. But when one approaches, one normally approaches towards the Great West Front, which of course is largely in the Norman or Romanesque style. And what we see nowadays is a truncated version of the original. I've played around with Photoshop to give you some sense of what the original would have looked like. This section here fell down, as far as we can gather, sometime in the 15th century and has not been rebuilt. The Romanesque style is so called because it was an emulation of Roman architecture, and in particular of Roman imperial architecture. And that was quite deliberate. It was taking on what was already the meaning of that Roman imperial architecture. That Roman imperial architecture said, we're in charge. It said, this is the Roman Empire, this is the part of the Roman Empire. So such buildings during the Roman Empire were built in outlying areas, in subject countries, to show that we were in charge, the Romans were in charge. And as I said, it had imperial connotations, and also connotations of victory. The Romans, of course, took over so many countries by being victorious in war. And what we see here in Rome is the Arch of Constantine, the triumphal Arch of Constantine, which put up, as many other arches scattered across the Roman Empire, were put up to celebrate victories in war. But of course, Constantine was the first the first Christian emperor, the one who not only made Christianity legal, but also encouraged it and made it clear that he was a Christian himself. So the memory of Constantine was a very important one in the Christian church, and the memory of the architecture connected with him was also an important one. And what we have, of course, fairly typical Roman architecture is these repeated arches with semicircular heads and columns. And just in the background, over on the right, you can see the Colosseum, which was also famous throughout Christendom, particularly as the place where so many early Christians, were martyred. And once again, we have classic Roman architecture, repeated arches of this kind, a splendid, impressive kind of architecture, which we've seen repeated or copied in a way on that great west front of Ely Cathedral. Not to say this is part of the Roman Empire. By the time we're getting into the 11th and 12th centuries, of course, the Roman Empire itself is long gone. We're part of the Norman culture now. But because this architecture, and particularly the triumphal arch form, was reinterpreted, as was the Roman Empire, in Christian terms. So what it was saying was, the Christendom has taken over all that is best of the Roman Empire. And the triumph that this architecture is celebrating is the triumph of Christ. So the triumph of Christ not by fighting physical human battles with ordinary weapons, but the triumph of Christ in a victory over all the powers of evil. And I show you this lovely detail from the wonderful 19th century alabaster high altar retable as a reminder of the beauties of some of the 19th century work, but also to illustrate the Palm Sunday, the procession of the church on Palm Sunday, which would have approached that great west front. So you've got the architecture itself showing these imperial, victorious signs, and you've got the yearly celebration by means of a procession of Palm Sunday, in which clergy and people would be walking around the outskirts of the cathedral precinct, perhaps around the town as well, and then finally approaching the west front of the cathedral as Christ, as Jesus, approached Jerusalem and entered Jerusalem. And the church itself is, of course, the heavenly Jerusalem. It's a sign of the heavenly Jerusalem. And I'll just show you this, which shows another procession to give you some idea of the colour and the splendour of such processions, particularly by the 15th century, but there's ample evidence from earlier on that such processions were very colourful and very splendid, and the architecture itself also highly coloured and painted and gilded to make the point that was to be made. So the procession of Palm Sunday in particular represented represents the coming of Christ, of Jesus, into Jerusalem. And the west front, the main entrance of the church, represents the entrance to the heavenly Jerusalem. And that's made quite clear in the service of the consecration of the church, in which repeated references are made to the church building as the material representative on earth of the heavenly Jerusalem. And that image comes from the great final book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, or the Apocalypse. So we have that image there, and the picture that St. John in the Apocalypse gives us of the heavenly Jerusalem coming down from heaven, he says, like a bride adorned for her husband. And alas, I live too far away from Ely to ever quite get there when the cathedral is floating on the mist below. I hope that one day I will obtain such a picture that I can show in this kind of lecture. But it does happen, and St. John's vision was of the heavenly Jerusalem coming down on the clouds, as it were, with the clouds below. And so that is a view, as I say, that I would dearly like to be able to take. And this is a church that is also a pilgrimage church. And I'll show you this just as a reminder of medieval pilgrimage. You'll find that the handout that we have to give you at the end says a little bit more about that. And pilgrimage, of course, was a great thing. There were many, many people going on pilgrimage to all sorts of places. This shows St. James the Great dressed as a pilgrim to his own shrine at Compostela in northern Spain. But Ely itself was a place of pilgrimage. It had, as we shall see, the shrines of Saint Etheldreda and of her sisters, and we'll see a little later the place where her shrine used to be, unfortunately destroyed at the Reformation. And it's worth remembering that the shape, the ground plan of the church itself has a Christian significance. It is a cross-shaped ground plan, so that whenever one is walking through the building, one is aware, even if only subliminally, of the fact that one is following a cross or walking within the space inside a cross. And at the very centre of the cross, we have nave and the transepts going across at right angles. And over here, we'll see the Lady Chapel. I'll see inside that a little later. And then over the crossing here, we have this great octagon, which is, to the best of my knowledge, unique in English cathedrals. And that octagonal shape has its own significance. It's the shape particularly of early Christian baptistries, that is, special buildings for the service of baptism, the entrance into the Christian faith, and also of the octagon shape of buildings built over the shrines of martyrs or the graves of martyrs. And the octagon was well known as a shape of great significance. Number 8, very, very important. And the medievals were quite interested. They thought that certain numbers had a mystical, metaphysical significance. And the number 8 represents eternity. And there are various aspects of this, but perhaps the easiest one to understand is we live in time which consists of a succession of 7-day weeks. So you go Sunday through to Saturday, and then you begin again with Sunday as the first day of the week, at least on the Christian accounting. So you never get an eighth day. The eighth day is eternity. At the end of time, the great eighth day will happen, and we will be out of time and in eternity. So the octagon represents eternity. It's appropriate for a baptistry because in entering the Christian life, one is entering eternal life. And for the tombs of the martyrs, it represents eternity because they are the ones who, having died for their faith, are, as it were, guaranteed to have gone straight into the eternal life of Christ. And inside that octagon, we have this wonderful illuminated space, designed to give a sense of the light flooding down from above onto that significant place at the crossing, at the centre of the cross. And in the middle, we have this carved boss of Christ. Christ, from the Gospel of St. Matthew, appearing at the last day, appearing in the clouds of heaven. And believe it or not, these little wiggly things around here signify the clouds in which Christ is descending. This boss, recarved in the 19th century restoration and recoloured, but not significantly changed. And what it shows is the Christ appearing in the heavens, but showing his wounds. So this is Christ the Redeemer, Christ the one who has won this battle against evil. And Christ at the centre of the octagon, at the centre of the cross, and at the top. And here we have the octagon lower parts. And what we know of the imagery here has been, I think, very wonderfully researched by Philip Lindley, who from what survives and also what we know of what was there originally has worked out the imagery of the octagon. And what was there, and still to some extent survives, was a sort of ascending, or you could think, since we started with the top, descending hierarchy of sanctity. So since we started with Christ, Christ at the top, then the universal sense, then the angels, seraphim and cherubim surrounding the throne of God, then saints, the great saints of the universal church, then on in these niches here, now with 19th century carvings of the apostles, but certainly originally with carvings of the apostles. And then, if we skip right down at the floor level, no longer surviving, but with evidence, documentary evidence of these, some local benefactors. So perhaps not quite saints, but people to be held in reverence because of their benefactions to the church. And then here, where I've put this massive double arrow, we have a series of corbels, 8 of them, which most people don't notice. But those corbels have scenes from the story of the local saint. So she fits in above the benefactors who are not perhaps yet saints, but below the apostles and the saints of the universal church, the cherubim and Christ. So you have that sense of being rooted in this place, and the, as it were, the sanctity of this place being rooted in where you are standing. And you can see there are ordinary people, there are the benefactors, there is Etheldreda, who was the saint in this place, living and dying in this place, and then all connected together in one sequence with Christ at the top and the centre. I've put in this simply to show you the difference that a bit of colouring makes to how you can read such a sculpture. Because when I'm going to show you each of those corbels of Etheldreda's life in turn. They don't have colouring, and many people would ask, well, how could anyone ever work out what they actually represented? Well, actually, they would have been coloured, and they would have been coloured in such a way as to make the message, the story, more readily understandable. So you have to hold that in mind as we look at these carvings. So it starts with Etheldreda's life, and we have Etheldreda's life in various versions, all pretty much consistent with each other. But in particular, we have it in the Venerable Bede, in Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English Nation. Very, very important document, that one. So Etheldreda felt called from an early age to a dedicated life. She wanted to be a nun, but she was the daughter of one of the rulers, one of the small kings of early Anglo-Saxon England, and as such was expected to be married. So she was married firstly to a chap called Tondbert, and here is the marriage, Etheldreda and Tondbert, with the bishop in between, making the marriage. And this corbel, as one of the others, is divided into two sections. The marriage to Tondbert was particularly important to Ely Cathedral because its original benefactions actually came from Etheldreda's own marriage settlement from Tondbert. Tondbert gave her some lands on which her little monastery was settled, and farming land to provide food and so forth for the community. So it was the basis, in fact, the practical material basis for the monastery. So that had a sort of double importance. It's an important part of her story, but also an important part of the monastery of Ely's story. But they were only married for quite a short time when he died, and this shows he is lying on his deathbed, and she is bending over him. And so she would have liked, at this stage, the marriage was not consummated. She would have liked then to go off and be a nun, but that was not possible, and she was married off again to a man called Egfrid. And this carving is very subtle and quite important, because there at the centre you have Etheldreda and Egfrid, but see in a close-up what is going on. Etheldreda is being pushed and pulled into the marriage. What the sculptor has done is to signify, by the way it has been set out, that she was very reluctant. She did not want to be married again. She did not want to be married at all. So he's shown, he's shown her mother behind her and her father in front of her. And the father's actually grabbing her right hand. Now, this is an important thing because the Christian church has always taught that marriage must be a free choice between the man and the woman. Of course, socially it hasn't always happened, but that was the teaching of the church. And so this is another subtlety of this. There is the father, and she is being forced into this. That is what the sculpture is saying. That marriage as well was not consummated, and after a few years, Etheldreda managed to talk Egfrid into releasing her from the marriage, and she left and became a nun. So the next one shows her being given her veil and consecrated as a nun. She is kneeling in front of the abbess with the bishop behind her. So there she is, a nun, but Egfrid changed his mind. And she got word of this and escaped and went off elsewhere. And he caught up with her together with a couple of her companions at a place called St. Abb's Head, which was a sort of, I think it must have been a little bit like the Isle of Lindisfarne, with a causeway at low tide, but which was covered with water at high tide. So he caught up with her when she was on St. Abb's Head, and the water became high tide and stayed high tide until Egfrid and his companions on horseback got tired of waiting and went away. Etheldreda falls asleep. Etheldreda gets to Ely, sleeps, and while she is asleep, her staff, which she has put upright in the ground, sprouts out, and this is a signal that this is the place for her monastery. She is enthroned as abbess by the bishop, and there are her sisters, nuns, behind her. And she lives a long and fruitful life as abbess of the community, and then she dies, and here is her death. And on the other side, and I take the interpretation by John Madison, who I think has got it right, whereas previous scholars have misinterpreted this. The Venerable Bede talks about how some years after her death, it was decided to take up her body out of the grave and put it into a splendid ancient Roman stone sarcophagus. And this, I'm pretty sure, is what this signifies. And then the final, eighth one, shows a posthumous miracle of Etheldreda's. The story is that a chap called Bricstan, who was on his way to join the monastery at Ely, was wrongfully arrested and thrown in prison in chains. And he prayed and prayed to St. Benedict and to St. Etheldreda. St. Benedict because Ely was a Benedictine monastery, and Etheldreda because she was the local saint at Ely. And then after a while, along comes Benedict and Etheldreda, and Benedict looses his chains. And he is shown thereby to be vindicated, and he goes with his chains to Ely to join the monastery, and Brickstan's chains were hung up by the shrine of St. Etheldreda. So the people who came as pilgrims looking at this story could see and be told the story of Bricstan, and then go and see the very chains that he had been wearing in prison and hanging by her shrine. In the choir section of the cathedral, there survive these wonderful choir stalls, carved choir stalls, which are largely the original choir stalls from the same date as the building of the Octagon. And I can only show you a couple of the carvings, a few of the carvings from these, but they have quite a fascinating range of carved figures on them, particularly on the misericords, where there is quite a range of images taken from the Bible, and I just show you this one. Wonderfully vigorous Samson with his long hair, so he's still very strong, pulling open the jaws of the marauding lion. And as I say, there are quite a few other images directly taken from the Bible carved there. But there are also some images which are more of a sort of, perhaps one might say, moral warning. Images of the devil, images of vices, and my apologies to any dentists who might be in the audience. This is not meant as any comment on actual dentists, but it's clearly a devilish creature attacking a human being. It's a warning about the wiles of the devil. And of course, at Compline, each evening, the monks would hear the verse from the Bible, from one of the epistles of St. Peter, which says, "Be sober, be vigilant, for your adversary the devil goes about like a roaring lion," or indeed, in some other monstrous guise, seeking someone to devour. Now, there's been a lot of interest paid to these carvings under the seats. They're called misericords. Not much attention has been paid to the other carvings, of which there are quite a lot on these choir stalls. And I really only have time to show you one of those as an example, talking of roaring lions going around to devour someone. Here we have, I can't see terribly well from here, we have a king. And there is a lion gnawing on his foot. And this carving is on the sort of shoulder level supports of these choir stalls. And there are quite a lot of such carvings all the way around of devilish, monstrous, grotesque kinds of creatures, which I'm sure have some significance. There is a story from the Cistercian writer Caesarius of Heisterbach about how one monk during one of the night services looked across at one of his colleague monks who was dozing and saw a nasty serpent crawling around his shoulders, which signified, as it were, the devilish temptation which was making that particular monk fall asleep when he should be paying attention to the prayers and the Bible readings. So I think there's a great deal more work to be done on seeing what interpretations might be given to these extra carvings that most people pay no attention to. I'm going to take you just for one slide outside the building. We're on the outside of the east end of the cathedral, and this, to the best of my knowledge, is a unique effect. What has been done here? Here we have the outer windows of the gallery level, that is the intermediate level, the triforium gallery level. But for 2 bays here, those windows have been taken to the inner side and a wall put across between to close off the sides of those bays. So for just 2 bays, you have windows further in than you have for all the other bays along the side of the building. And those 2 bays happen to correspond with the original placing of the shrine of St. Etheldreda. Long gone, but now shown by this inscription in the floor. And unfortunately, I was about an hour too late to get the placing absolutely spot on, but you can see here the light coming through the window falling on the floor. Now you might say, but that's falling on the floor, it's not actually hitting the shrine area. But you have to think, we have a tall shrine. You have there would have been a stone base of this kind, a tall stone base of this kind, and then a very elaborate gold and jewelled, this is a modern one of course, but a gold and jewelled reliquary up on top. And if you think of that sort of height, then the light through those windows would have illuminated on a good day. On a cloudy day, not so good, but we do get some sunny days in Ely, and the effect can be quite dramatic even now, even without that shrine. I promised you a view of the interior of the Lady Chapel. We saw it from above when we were looking down on the cross shape of the cathedral and the shape of the octagon. And what we have here is, if not the largest, certainly one of the largest of the chapels specifically dedicated to the Virgin Mary, a special building for services in her honour. And in a monastic cathedral, as Ely was, this would be the place where the polyphonic music started to be used. The monks had to stay with plain chant, but for services in honour of the Virgin Mary, polyphony would have been possible. And so one needs to think in terms, particularly in the later Middle Ages, of the development of wonderfully elaborate sung music in her honour. The building looks totally different from what it would have looked originally, particularly in the lack of colouring. We know that it originally had stained glass in all the windows. We know that a lot of the stonework was painted. We know that it had a whole series of large statues. It's been calculated probably something like 145, 147 statues, all of which are totally gone, destroyed probably at the Reformation in the 16th century. Under Bishop Goodrich, who was a very firmly Protestant reformer. But we can get some sense of what the colouring might have been like from the small amount that remains of the original glass, which is in this very characteristic early 14th century colouring, particularly with a lot of greens and golds. So you have to think in terms of green and gold light coming through the windows down onto that stonework. And of course, the window has representations of saints and particularly angels. I like the musical angels. There are some very splendid ones up in the upper parts. Angels making music, praising God with music, and we'll see something more of that in a moment. And this lower level has these wavy canopies with lots of abstract leaf decoration here. And I think that with the painted colouring, and particularly with that greeny light coming in through the windows, this will have looked not unlike a garden with a sort of wavy hedge or whatever, all the way around the inside of the building. And I think that is not just a matter of the fashion of the time. I think it was a deliberate reference to the fact that this is a lady chapel, and that the Virgin Mary, among other things, was referred to as a garden enclosed. There are many late medieval paintings on the continent. Unfortunately, any English ones have been destroyed. But many such paintings which show the Virgin and Child seated in an enclosed garden. It's an image that comes from the biblical Old Testament book, the Song of Songs, and the garden enclosed is a metaphor for the virginity of the bride, and hence the virginity of the Virgin Mary. So I think what we have here is an attempt, as it were, to portray in the actual architecture an image of Mary herself in the building in which she was being celebrated. And there's more there, of course. Around in the spandrels around here, there was a series of carved images of scenes from the life of the Virgin Mary. Now terribly damaged. I don't think any figure has a head remaining on it. But you may just be able to make out here, cut right back to the face of the stone, that is the Annunciation. Gabriel and Mary, Gabriel greeting Mary with the announcement that she is to become the mother of Christ. And on the other side of it, you have the visitation, Mary going to see her cousin Elizabeth. But we've also got these figures here, most of which are so damaged that we can't really work out what they were. But this one and one other we can actually interpret. And we can interpret partly by looking at an undamaged figure. Here, in the wonderful angels of the angel choir, you have this angel playing a harp. And if you look, you can see this funny bit at the bottom is the soft chamois leather cover that would protect the harp when it was not being used. And it would be opened at the front, opened at the top, and then just dropped down to the bottom when the harp was being played. And there it is, the folds of it at the bottom. And that helps us to understand this very badly damaged image, which shows just that part of the harp and the remains of the bag at the bottom of it. And the other one that we can interpret is this King Solomon. Solomon in judgment. That was, of course, the characteristic thing about Solomon. So he's got unsheathed sword upright in one hand. He's got the remains of his sceptre in the other, and the crossed legs, which strangely enough represent authority, not quite what we might expect nowadays, but there is a lot of evidence of that meaning. You find it, for instance, in illuminated manuscripts. You find it on some of the kings carved on the west front of Lincoln Cathedral. Well, I'm going to finish with something that is very close to my heart, perhaps going from the sublime to the frivolous, I'm not quite sure. But I do like the sheer range of small carvings, creatures of various kinds that one finds, particularly at Ely in the Lady Chapel. But also in other parts of the cathedral, and you find it in other cathedrals as well. Lincoln again comes to mind for obvious reasons. It's one of the cathedrals I know very well indeed. And I talked at the beginning about the Bible and the Psalms, and how those who commissioned this building would be steeped in the imagery of the Bible. And so we have a whole range of little creatures of various kinds, some of them grotesque, most of them carved with such an obvious delight in creating something perhaps of beauty, something of charm. There is a lot in the Bible celebrating the sheer variety of creation, but also celebrating the way in which human artists can partake of the creativity of God by carving the whole range of creatures, or by portraying them, or by simply praising God for them. And so I don't know what this creature is, nor do I know quite what this one is. It's very appealing, whatever it is. Dog, pig, not at all sure. But my favourites, I think, are the dragons. And the dragons, of course, have had a bad press. One sees St. George or St. Michael the Archangel killing the dragon because the dragon represents evil, represents Satan. And that's because in that last book of the Bible, the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, you have that wonderful image of the final battle between good and ill, where Michael, the archangel, and his angels battle against that old dragon, which is Satan. But of course, the dragon can only represent Satan if there is some sense of what a dragon simply as a creature might be. And we have to remember that in the Middle Ages, people knew a lot less about the range of creatures that there are available in the world. We now know that there aren't any dragons, but they didn't know that. And I'd be inclined to think that a medieval person, when told, I grew up in Australia, so when told about a platypus, might well not believe that such a thing could possibly exist. A fur-covered, egg-laying mammal with a duck's bill, I would perhaps think it impossible. So I'm leaving you with the Ely family of dragons. These are the two sides of one of those arches in the Lady Chapel. And as I interpret it, what we've got is, on this side, a mother and baby dragon, and on the other side, a father dragon protecting them. But as I say, I just thought I'd finish with something perhaps a little frivolous, but nice to see. So, thank you.